Coming up on tonight's Faith versus Culture, former Mumford Sons member Winston Marshall speaks out on cancel culture. We'll have more coming right up.
To have sex before you marry is a bad idea.
Don't tell me there's no such thing as gun violence.
That just depends on your definition of when life begins.
There are problems of sin and habit that cannot be solved outside the person of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Well, welcome to Faith versus Culture. We have a fascinating conversation today about cancel culture and redemption and finding renewed purpose. I'm joined by my colleague, Billy Hallowell, and our guest today, Winston Marshall, a former member of Mumford Sons. Winston, how are you doing today?
Trey, I'm very well, thank you. And thank you both, you and Billy, for having me on your show.
Well, thanks for
Of course,
coming
thank you so much for being here.
I want to ask you, just kind of digging in on your story, and I know you've spoken a lot about this, but for people who don't know, obviously you ended up walking away from the band, you ended up leaving, and a lot of interesting things led up to that. But it all started with a book and your support for a book. Can you take us through those events that sort of, I guess, initiated the controversy that you faced years ago in the first place?
Yeah, sure. So this was in the pandemic, and life really came to a standstill. Initially, there was some peace to it. I was reading all the books that I hadn't had time to read, from Tolstoy's War and Peace to Mao's Little Red Book and everything in between, from things that I hadn't got to read and then things that were interesting me at the time. But one of the books I posted about was by American conservative journalist Andy Ngo, documenting far-left extremism in the United States, documenting the BLM riots of 2020, and mainly focusing on Portland and Seattle, the burning of the federal building there. When it came to the riots, it was, the 19 deaths in the first 14 days of the riots, that kind of stuff. Now, this tweet, I only had about 3,000 followers, but in my country, and I think in this country, it went up all the trending lists on Twitter. I'd never experienced that before. I'd never even really fathomed what that's like. And it was just like an onslaught, not just to me, but the people around me, people I was working with. And, a real abuse. They were changing my Wikipedia from Winston Marshall as a banjo player to Winston Marshall as a fascist. And
Wow.
It was just like totally insane. And anyway, I'd been open to, perhaps I didn't know everything about the subject. And anyway, my bandmates were very distraught and upset. And so I wanted to kill the story, and I wanted to make it right. I wanted to protect them. And under considerable duress, I issued an apology. And in the period that came after that, I really got to grips with the topic itself. And I came to the conclusion I'd been wrong to apologize. Actually, those things were bad. Those aforementioned riots were bad. The behavior of far left extremists in the States were not good things. And I felt like I was in some way part of the lie that either that they were good things or that they didn't exist. And that apology really sort of hung around my neck like a sort of tablet of shame. And I came to the conclusion, there's a bunch of other things were happening simultaneously, including the author of the book was attacked again by Antifa thugs in Portland, and the video of that went out online, horrific footage, and him escaping into a hotel somehow. And I just felt like I couldn't deal with it anymore. And at the same time, to have my opinion would be bring shame, big problems rather onto the band. So I was in this situation where really the only thing I could do to protect both my conscience and my integrity was to issue a retraction of the apology, but have to leave the band. But this isn't I speak to you now 18 months later. This isn't a sort of woe is me story at all. The Lord works in mysterious ways, and I feel like it's now a duty for me to speak up on these issues, because I think a lot of people can't. And one of the things I experienced when I published my resignation letter, or the letter, and I quit the band, I got hundreds, if not thousands, of people expressing their understanding of the sense of self-censorship. And I think that self-censorship is something that right now, or certainly over the last few years, is a very, very prominent phenomenon, that there are just topics that people think it's better to keep shut up than actually speak it, because it brings too much hassle to speak it. So
can I pause you there for a minute? Because how do you know, there are people who are listening to this, watching this right now, who are terrified to speak. They have silenced themselves, and they're looking at what happened to you and other people, and that just, it's like this vicious cycle. It just feeds that. What do you say to those people who are petrified to speak and they're silencing themselves?
Well, firstly, I'd offer. It's a good question. I would. One thing that bothered me was that when I initially apologized, I got a lot of attacks. People saying like, "Don't never apologize." You're a coward. Now, the anti-woke crowd came after me. Go, now I hope you get cancelled. And the anti-woke crowd are just as bad as the woke crowd, by the way, or at least the extremities of them are. And what I'd say is that there's a lot of pressure. You've got families to support. You've got your careers you've worked up for a long time. You've got mortgages. Life is hard, and there are other things in life that are worth protecting. So I understand if you feel like you can't speak, and that's a difficult decision to make. The one thing that I'm now enjoying is building a life so that actually I can speak, and that I'm trying to build a life in a way that I'm sort of, quote, uncancelable, to use the jargon of the age. And so I can say what I think, and that's not for everyone. It's not for everyone. It's not everyone's duty to sort of get embroiled in arguments and fights, and that it's neither does that suit everyone's disposition or character. That actually, I'll tell you something that I found really enlightening. I was speaking to Ignat Solzhenitsyn, who's Alexander Solzhenitsyn's son, and as well as being a highly accomplished classical musician in his own right, he's also probably the leading expert on his father's literature and his father's work. And we were discussing Live Not by Lies, which was the essay that Solzhenitsyn Sr. published as he was exiled from Moscow in 1974. And in that essay, he said, and that essay really struck me, like that before I quit the band, that I'd read that like 5 or 6 times, like it was really affecting my conscience. That was the thing that was really, one of the other factors is really sort of hitting my soul, pounding it. But what Ignat Solzhenitsyn Jr. Told me is, he said, it's not about making a great stand. The interpretation of that essay is, what Alexander is saying is, just don't participate in the lie. So you don't have to stand up and make a stance and sacrifice necessarily. But when there are things that are not true, don't participate. That it's as simple as that. I think actually, as a bare minimum, that's a pretty good standard. That means that you don't have to say, quit your job or whatever. But if you're made to go along with things that you don't agree with, just quietly say no. And some people will be forced into that sort of position. I actually feel like I was forced into that position. I'm not sure I would have willingly chosen it. But so fate might take you on a certain journey there. But I think the bare minimum is not to participate in the lie. I think that's a pretty good standard.
Yeah, no, I think that is the case, and we're going to talk about that and so much more on the other side of the break. So we'll be right back with more with Winston on Faith versus Culture. Well, welcome back to Faith versus Culture. We're joined now by Winston Marshall. Winston, you mentioned in the first segment a little bit about spirituality and feeling like you were being spiritually attacked, obviously in a negative way, when all of this happened 18, 19 months ago. Tell us a little bit about how you handled that, how your faith maybe helped you process some of that.
Well, that speaking the matters of spirits, and I appreciate in the first half of this conversation, I brought that topic up myself. So I put myself in this situation. It's often very difficult to articulate these things. So I'm certainly in danger of misrepresenting how I think, or perhaps some of my thoughts are unformed. But I would say that yeah, the experience of being at the center of that that hellish weekend for me, it felt like to be honest, it was seeing my mother's reaction that really affected me, and she's actually quite a spiritual woman anyway, so she was probably more sensitive to it. But it's not just it's attack of reputation. As I said, they come after your Wikipedia. Then by the second day or third day, it's in all the newspapers, and then it's a segment on The View and on Tucker Carlson and everything. So it just felt like a complete swarm of hornets, and coming from every angle, and then your friends start calling you up, and your colleagues, and it's just everything sort of implodes. I had a dream at the time that I was on an airplane, and then the airplane just stopped mid-flight and then just went backwards and just started plummeting backwards down. It felt like everything was just coming apart. So I was very sensitive to what was going on at the time. And it feels weird quoting Kanye West now after the last sort of few months he's had, but he said something which I think at the time I found helpful, is that if you fear God, you fear nothing else. And that's not to say that I necessarily think you should fear God. I mean, I do think in some aspects you should fear God, but I think God is love. So it's not to say that God is a fearful.
It's reverence. Reverence it's like that deep respect,
that's right?
Yeah.
Revere God and you'll fear nothing else. That's a better word. I prefer that. Yeah. And for me, trusting him, and it still happens now. I still get these little swarms, but trusting him and putting it in his hands is actually totally liberating, and has been a point of succor, a point of it's been, it's kept me free from those worldly worries. It's not to say I don't also have my weaker moments, obviously, where I worry about and I have anxiety about certain things, but my faith has certainly helped me get through this very stormy few years. I know I'm babbling and bumbling.
No, you know what? I think
only because it's quite hard to articulate.
You're processing it, right? I mean, this is, it's very much, it's been 18 months, but a lot happened and a lot continues to happen, right? I think when you have this dream and you're living this life and you're thrown out of that, like you were saying, this wasn't something you chose. It was a path you were put on, and now here you are. I've got to ask you, coming off of the spiritual side of things, looking at culture, when you look at what happened to you for a simple tweet about a book that some people don't like, how do you think we allowed culture to become so chaotic and almost cartoonish that somebody's opinion on something means that they're going to have to literally append their entire life just because a group of people didn't like it? How did we allow this to happen, in your view?
That's a good question. I think you can look at actually the music industry, and I think what happened to me in some ways shows how the music industry is very small, as is the creative industry, and there's a lot of groupthink, and so the way in which I've sort of been ostracized from that group, but at the same time I'm now working at the most respected political magazine, or one of the most respected political magazines in the country. It sort of shows how much of an echo chamber the music industry is. But I would also say that all industries are an echo chamber, because all communities form their own echo chamber. That's that's a normal human experience. That's not to say it's a good thing. We should always be trying. I pledged a few years ago to myself to read every book that I get recommended, because it was the only way I could ensure I don't get stuck in an echo chamber. Now, I still get caught in my own echo chamber, obviously, but I think it's a normal thing to happen. And so now, as a society, how we've got into that, a few things at play here. As I already mentioned, that the pandemic drove everyone nuts, and because it was a nutty time. Like, it was unbelievable stress that we were all under, and everyone was probably stuck and glued to their phones, and we just didn't act normally. So then there's a few topics sort of seem to be particularly problematic.
Off limits, if you will. Off limits, yeah.
Yeah.
But I also think, I don't think it's a modern phenomenon. So I think it's a human phenomenon. And in fact, in de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, he describes this. I forget exactly where, but he writes about how there are some political topics which are perfectly normal to discuss. And then at a certain turning point, people who hold those ideas need to be cut out like a cancer. So he uses language like that or something like that. I need to revisit that. But there's a great Tablet magazine article writing about that as well, describing that. And if you remember, for example, a version of this was that you look at someone like Trump. Before he was president, he was hosting SNL, he was on the television, and then suddenly he went from, like, in perfectly accepted in high society, if not a bit annoying to people, to like the devil. and that there was a moment, and it changed probably when he became president. But there are historical examples of cancel culture. Galileo, although Galileo also the myth goes, retracted his apology, per se muove, and so indeed the earth does move around the sun, and Socrates, and so it's not a modern phenomenon. I just think that the combination of social media, the pandemic, and a few other issues has just made that particular demon of human nature rear its head again in this period.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of truth to that, because I do think that there's nothing necessarily new, right, to culture. It presents itself differently, I think, with each generation and each iteration of society. But I want to ask, when the rubber meets the road, when we face things like this, obviously you've faced a lot of public adversity that you've had to deal with in a public way. How has it maybe changed you or challenged some of your perspectives, and how you might handle a similar situation should you find yourself in the same place again?
Yeah, well, one thing I do is that when I see it happening to others, I don't I withdraw. I don't judge them, because firstly, I know that they must be under extreme pressure. Secondly, I avoid engaging in ad hominem as best I can, and anything personal, because that's just unnecessary. When we're in the when we're dealing with issues, we should never let it get personal. It's not personal. It's issues, and you should act in good faith. Assume that everyone wants a better world, and we're all engaging these conversations because we all want a better world. So that's one thing. And then another thing. In fact, this happened last weekend. Bill Maher did a segment about woke culture going too far, and used my story, but he only used the bit where I read the book and then apologized for the book, and sort of ridiculed me for it, without mentioning the bit that I retracted and quit the band. But that now, which I'm fine with, and I tweeted the correction to him, but I'm in a position where that stuff can't. I've got nothing they can take from me anymore. They took what they could, and so in a way I feel untouchable. But I also you just got to have faith. You got to give it up to him, and try and act as he has taught us to act. I think trusting him is a pretty key element to deal with anything like that.
Well, I got to tell you, your story is incredible. Your perspective is incredible. And we appreciate you coming on the show today. You got to come back again.
Billy, Trey, thank you very much for having me. I hope I haven't been too boring for your listeners. I'll say one last thing.
Do it. Go for it.
If your listeners did like hearing me, I invite them to listen to my podcast, Marshall Matters. And I also have just launched a Substack called the Winstack, which you can find. And these are part of my new endeavors now that I'm rebuilding my life. And there might be little things there for your listeners they might enjoy.
You have been amazing. And everyone else, make sure you just stay tuned. We'll be right back after the break with more Faith versus Culture. We're back with more Faith versus Culture on the CBN News Channel. That was Winston Marshall. Trey, what was your take? I mean, what a crazy story.
I mean, I think the thing that's so fascinating about his story is something that really is a common thread throughout so many people who have been canceled at one point or another is they were blindsided by it, right? They had no idea that it was coming. But I think his story really just shows resiliency, right? Because he could have given up and kind of left the public sphere and just lived a private life. But instead, he's chosen to kind of lean in and say, look, I was wrong to have apologized. I was right with what I said initially. And he's kind of found new purpose and renewed passion in his life, which I think is fascinating. And I think it's also encouraging for people who face similar circumstances. Obviously, we're not all celebrities, but we could face a similar circumstance in our sphere of influence. And I think bouncing back and finding our purpose, whatever God has for us, is important. And I think Winston has shown that that is possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And what he said about trusting God, a great message, even when hard things happen, embarrassing things happen, whatever it is, good or bad, always trusting God. All right, with that said, we're taking one more break and we'll be back with more Faith versus Culture in just a moment. Welcome back to Faith versus Culture. That is all the time that we have for this episode of the show. Make sure you stay tuned to future episodes on the CBN News Channel.